Welcome to the Wolf Daily News Channel. Conflicts in the war between Ukraine and Russia escalate more and more towards the end of January. Russian President Vladimir Putin paints rosy pictures about the Ukraine war with his state. The Kremlin leader said that the military operation in Ukraine is gaining positive momentum, and he hopes his troops will gain further victories after Russia takes control of the salt mining town of Sodar in eastern Ukraine. This was a rare success for Moscow after months of battlefield, although it meant nothing at the front. Putin now sees the war in Ukraine as an existential war with an aggressive and arrogant West, and states that Russia will use all available means to protect itself and its people against any aggressor. However, the words and actions of the Russian leader of Vladimir Putin do not support each other, emphasizing that the Ukrainian war is progressing in a good direction. The Russian leader shocks everyone by changing the commander of the war. Recently, Russian Chief of Staff, Valery Zhov, was appointed head of the Russian army, surpassing a position previously held by Sergei Serovcan for only a few months. Serovcan became the 13th general to be fired by Putin after February 20. Probably Ov can be fired within 2 months at the appointment of Valery Gurima as head of the Russian army reflects some of the systemic challenges that the Russian army has faced since the beginning of this invasion. The appointment of the Chief of Staff as operational commander is an indication of the growing seriousness of the situation Russia is facing, and he openly acknowledges that the operation lags behind Russia's strategic objectives. The Kremlin military shock came as Russia and Ukraine engaged in intense frontline combat in the Sodar salt mining town on the outskirts of Bakhmut, where Russian forces have recently refocused their efforts. The severity of the concussion in the Kremlin army was enough to affect the Kremlin administration. With the moves made by Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin began to crackle inside. Putin faces Kremlin rebellion as Ukraine uncovers the real reason behind military. Ukraine's defense chief took a look at the power struggle at the top of the Kremlin, explaining why Vladimir Putin recently changed military chiefs. Vladimir Putin recently announced that his military commanders leading the war in Ukraine have changed dramatically. Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov announced that there is a power struggle within the Kremlin. Alexei Reznikov stated that the main reason behind the unexpected reshuffle in the Moscow army was that the demoted commander was wasting Russia's missile stocks, as is known. The Russian armed forces were led by Sergei Serovcan. However, during Surovi's army command, many casualties were incurred in terms of ammunition. And military failures were blamed on Sergeican was removed from the position of Chief of Operations and almost sentenced to a penalty. The Russian Ministry of Defense has announced that the current commander, Sergeican, will be one of the 3 deputies of Valery Ov. Let's take a look at how these shocking developments in the Moscow army affected the Kremlin administration. Sergei Se had commanded the Russian army for 3. Considering the course of the Ukrainian war, the Moscow army could not achieve the desired success in this 3-month period, let alone achieving success. The Kremlin military units could not make a significant breakthrough in this process from the beginning of the war to this time. Russia's most well-known tactic was to destroy the Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. With this tactic, Russia aimed to tire its opponent and drag it into a dead General Ken's strategy of devastating attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure has inconclusively reduced Russian missile stockpiles. With this wasteful strategy, General Ken shot himself in the foot. At the same time, allegations that Russia's missiles were exhausted, humiliated, and infuriated President Putin, while many see Vladimir Putin's move to replace the commander of the Russian army as a promotion for General Gu. It's a sort of demotion for the most poisonous goblets. Vladimir Putin is often questioned by his decision. The Kremlin's view of the Russian leader is losing more and more value with each passing day, but Mr. Putin is struggling to renew the strength of the Russian army despite the setbacks. The conflicts in the 11th month in the east of the war in Ukraine and in the Donbass continue with all their violence. Meanwhile, the manpower situation in Russia worsens. The Kremlin is increasingly forced to rely on convicts to support the defense and aerospace industry. More than 10 months have passed in the conflict, and Ukraine continues to gain the upper hand. However, soon as the war season approaches, both sides will be forced to attack once again. What they get will determine when the war ends. The Russian army continues to suffer terrible losses on land. In the first few weeks of the new year, Moscow lost more than 8,000 soldiers on land, as well as hundreds of tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry, fighting vehicles, artillery shells, and other weapon systems. To complicate the life of the Kiev forces at the front, Moscow is running out of ammo. The lack of ammunition in places like Bakhmut, especially artillery shells, complicates offensive operations and allows Ukrainian forces to defend better. With the huge losses suffered by the Moscow army, Vladimir Putin takes action. In a move reminiscent of Nazi Germany, Russia employs convicts in the defense and aerospace industries. Notably, Russia's largest tank maker announced in November that it would employ 250 inmates to work in its production plants after receiving the green light from the government. With over 400,000 prisoners, Russia has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. Russia's Federal Criminal Service sought to reduce this number by allowing the notorious Wagner Group, mercenary group, to recruit prisoners to fight from their prisons in Ukraine. While the prison population provides Russian leaders with a unique human resource to use to support the special military operation, willing volunteers are short on using prisoners for forced labor, is nothing new in Russia. There is a long tradition of using prisoners for the benefit of the. But 6 years ago, the Kremlin passed a law allowing forced labor as a special punishment. Prisoner craftsmanship will be in particular demand from relatively low-tech weapons manufacturers like UVZ, which are under intense pressure from Moscow to increase their production. At the same time, Russian President Vladimir Putin could soon face a devastating loss in the war in Ukraine that could cost him his entire. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has intensified his rhetoric in recent months to demand that Crimea be recognized as part of his country once again, and this proposition is gaining ground as his military forces appear to have an advantage over the invading Russians. According to sources familiar with Russia's, the loss of the peninsula it took by force in 2014 can be seen as one of Putin's greatest defeats in the war, and the setback could result in the end of Putin's presidency. Putin and Kremlin officials said Russia would only enter peace talks with Ukraine if Zelensky recognized the 4 Ukrainian territories that Russia illegally annexed in September. Meanwhile, Zelensky has repeatedly made it clear that not only will he not allow Russia to claim these lands, but also that he wants Crimea to be part of Ukraine. Again, giving up control of Crimea would not only be a black mark on Putin's military, but would also unleash the wrath of the Russian elite. However, even if Putin retains Crimea, his reign as president could end due to the. Even if Russia wins the Kremlin's current war objectives, the outcome in Ukraine inflicts a devastating strategic defeat on Russia shaken by strategic defeats. We look forward to the stance of the Russian leader and the Kremlin administration in the Ukraine war in the coming days. Thank you for watching the video. If you find it useful, please comment and share the video for us. It will make our channel more known. See you in the following videos. Thank you very much.